Welcome to the latest episode of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. We're back after a short break because Bernard, quite sensibly, has been sunning himself in foreign climes, escaping the Scottish autumn and indeed the developing British winter. Bernard, it's great to have you back. Today we're going to talk about the difficulties that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer face. We could be talking about these every week, couldn't we? It does seem unfortunate that shortly after losing Angela Rayner, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and Deputy Prime Minister, to a housing-related problem, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a month before she delivers a crucial make-or-break budget, is also facing questions over her housing arrangements, specifically renting out her house in Dulwich without the kind of licence that is required. More importantly, though, perhaps, was at Prime Minister's questions this week, the suggestion from the Prime Minister that Labour's manifesto promises on tax can no longer be considered to be written in stone. We'll discuss that, plus closer to home and here in Scotland, warning from the Auditor General that the Scottish Government's own financial forecasts lack clarity and there is no clear evidence that the government knows whether it's getting value for money from its spending. We'll consider all of that. But Bernard, great to have you back. Where were you?
Malaga and Seville, temperatures of 25 degrees. And I got back yesterday and the rain was stoating off the ground in Glasgow, which made me want to get back on a plane.
It's almost as though it's a pathetic fallacy, isn't it? And very apt for the political mood, because the first things first, Rachel Reeves and her housing problem, it seems to me that this will blow over relatively quickly, in as much as it is not going to cost her job, because her letting agency has taken one for the team, if you like. But it is clearly the kind of distraction a month before the budget that she and the Prime Minister could do without.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of points in this story. The first one is that when it first broke, or the information was known about, if you're a senior government minister, the first thing that you do, almost, because you ask yourself the question, where could this go, is that whatever you have on your ministerial desk, you clear everything, you establish all of the facts, you get to full disclosure, and you shut the story down, essentially. That's what you do. And she hasn't managed to do it. Now, on the substance of the issue, and as you're saying, the letting agents have taken one for the team, this is not, in my view, a sackable offence. It's not a resignation matter. But we learned from your newspaper that again, it has
His Majesty's Times.
Yes,
yep.
It hasn't been particularly well handled. So she eventually faces up and said, "Yeah, the licensing of this wasn't correct. I should have been on top of this. It's now all in place. The letting agents are dealing with it." She then tells Starmer that's the story, and he said, "Fine." Inadvertent error. And now we learn from the Times that, in fact, there was an email trail between the agents and her partner where all of this was pointed out. And she's had to go back to the Prime Minister and say, "Oh, you remember what I said to you, that this was all just about the letting agents and it's now fine and it's an inadvertent mistake? Actually, we did know about it because my partner knew about it. So I'm now telling you the full story. This is now version 2. Starmer then has to ask the advisor to the Ministerial Code whether or not there is anything which is worth investigating. No, there's not. You're right, it will be closed down. But it's another example of just how completely and utterly shoddy they deal with these issues are. Anything which is about money or the mere hint of things not being played by the rule book, you have to get on top of it, you have to have full disclosure, and you have to make sure that the story doesn't grow legs. So we had a day 1 in this story, and we now have a day 2 in this story because of this email trail between the agents and the Chancellor's partner. And that will mean that the opposition will not let this go, although it will, in my view, blow over.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And it is quite extraordinary that you have senior members of the government who just seem incapable of recognizing that by virtue of being senior members of the government, all their actions in all of these areas are going to be scrutinized in remorseless, relentless detail, and that therefore it is incumbent upon them to make sure that they are whiter than white, in the words of Tony Blair from many, many years ago. Now, of course, people might draw their own conclusions about how whiter than white Mr. Blair has been since leaving Downing Street himself. But nevertheless, let's move to the more substantive part of these of this week's events, I would suggest, and do something unusual, something that we haven't often had cause to do on the podcast, and that is praise Kemi Badenoch, who elicited a genuinely newsworthy answer from the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's Questions this week, and that in itself is unusual. In July, on July 9th to be precise, Kemi Badenoch had asked Keir Starmer if Labour's promises on tax, as outlined in the party's manifesto at the last general election, if they still stood. And that those promises, you remember, were not to touch income tax, national insurance or VAT. And the Prime Minister stood up and he said, yes. And then he sat down. This week, on Wednesday, Kemi Badenoch asked word for word exactly the same question. And rather than saying yes or no, which was the easy way out of the question, the Prime Minister delivered a long piece of waffle, frankly, a kind of prime ministerial verbiage that very clearly, pertinently, obviously did not rule out changes to income tax or VAT or national insurance. The suggestion that Labour's manifesto commitment is not actually as written in stone as it was as recently as July, therefore dominated the following day's headlines. So, Bernard, my questions to you, actually it's two questions, are: do you expect the government to break these manifesto promises? If they do, will that be damaging? If it is to be damaging, how damaging will it be?
Those who listen to the podcast will know that for the last year, I have been saying that this manifesto commitment will not see the lifetime of a parliament. So the answer to the question is yes. The second issue is that it will be very political damaging, because the story that will emerge from the government or from the budget will be that there's a manifesto commitment which has been broken, and that Labour cannot be trusted and all that kind of stuff. Therefore, the issue is, which of the three taxes do they go for? Where does the breach actually come? Now, we can write what the plea in mitigation is going to be. The plea in mitigation will be that circumstances are even worse than they thought they had inherited, and they do this with a heavy heart, etc., etc., etc. So where will they go? There have been one or two articles this week which would suggest that the Chancellor is actively looking at increasing income tax, not by 1p in the pound, but by 2p in the pound. There's also a suggestion, or there is a debate which is happening within Labour, and the traction for this is the observations of the Resolution Foundation, that one of the things that they should consider doing is increasing the basic rate of income tax by 2p in the pound and cutting the rate of national insurance by 2p in the pound. And the overall effect of that will be that the Chancellor will be able to save some money. The downside of that is that whilst that might be relatively good news for some, it would be a disaster for pensioners, because pensioners, of course, people who have reached the state pension age no longer pay national insurance. And it would be particularly bad news for pensioners who let out property in order to supplement their pensions. So they would be then back into the whole stushy of a government which is attacking pensioners, should they take the strictures of the Resolution Foundation and go for increases in income tax and a cut in national insurance. I think the politics of the income tax stuff is very, very perilous. If I was the Chancellor, I would be looking at a number of things, three things, and I'll deal with these very quickly and get your take on this. The first thing is that I would simply allow fuel duties to run their course. It will bring in some money. It won't bring in enough, but it will bring in some money. I think that they should be much more lax on the issue of VAT. Because in a sense, it's a tax which people don't see. If it's coming off your wage packet, you see it and you get angry about it. So in terms of fuel duties, allow them to increase. In terms of VAT, I would look at raising money there. And the third thing, again, because it increases the tax take, but it doesn't look like a tax increase, is to reverse what she's previously announced on the personal allowance, which is due to go up in 2028. The Conservatives had a policy of freezing it until 2029 and probably push that out to 2030. So a mixture of VAT increases, fuel duty, and pushing out the freezing the personal allowance by another couple of years would be the least politically damaging thing to do. But as we've said on this podcast before, the one thing that Reeves and Starmer do not have is assured political touch. So heaven knows where we'll end up.
Well, indeed. I think the other thing that is absolutely certain to happen in the budget is very significant increases on gambling, and the gambling companies and so on are going to be clobbered in the budget and so on. And I suspect there will also be there's the potential for adding to the bank levy. Because the banks are all pleasingly profitable at the moment, and they already pay a higher rate of corporation tax than other companies, but there is scope there probably to increase that. But overall, these things are $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and so on. They are all useful contributors to the overall fiscal position that the Chancellor needs to create, but they're not large enough either individually or cumulatively to make the kind of difference that she requires. And so you have a situation where, as Paul Johnson, formerly head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, said recently, that the government essentially has a choice between doing something that is going to be politically extraordinarily painful, possibly disastrous, and something that is going to be economically extraordinarily painful and possibly disastrous. And, in general terms, one would think that they will choose to take the path that is the least politically damaging. But on the other hand, the Chancellor's credibility rests on doing the right thing economically. And I think one thing that is apparent is that she understands that if you have these fiscal rules that you have to abide by, and you have kind of boxed yourself in there, then you cannot have a thing every year, twice a year, in fact, where the question comes up, do you have enough fiscal headroom? When you're talking about, 10 billion here, that margin for error is so small, it's unsustainable. It's almost reckless, in fact, when you're talking about what is in the end £1 trillion budget. And so creating the conditions whereby you have more margin for error, for unexpected events, to take their course, sure, but they're not necessarily going to blow the budget calculations out of the water. Well, that means you need to have fiscal headroom of, I would suggest, at least 40 or 50 billion pounds. Now, whether she can achieve that in a single budget remains to be seen. But in the longer term, that kind of sustainability, it seems to me, is absolutely essential, because otherwise you get into a sort of rinse and repeat situation whereby every year you get this question about tax increases or spending cuts. And we've already determined that spending cuts appear to be impossible. The very, very modest changes to benefits that were proposed in the welfare bill were rejected by the Parliamentary Labour Party.
Yeah.
And that sent a message, obviously. Similarly, tax increases are very, very unpopular, and it's quite clear that adding to the burden of on business is unsustainable. And to some extent, the government is doing that anyway with its employment rights bill, which is not something that business welcomes. When you couple that with the impact of the employer's national insurance changes from last year, then, you create a situation whereby, once again, if growth is the only way out of the big picture, long-term fiscal predicament in which the United Kingdom finds itself, then why are you taking measures that are clearly at best neutral on growth and possibly hostile to growth. And so again, you come back to this question, what is politically palatable or feasible within the Parliamentary Labour Party and what is economically necessary are often actually at loggerheads. And so where do you find that balance?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll ask you that, buddy. Where do you find that balance?
Paul Johnson is very effectively what he points out is that every decision that a Chancellor of the Exchequer takes has a political consequence and an economic consequence. And we can already see in terms of some of the bigger spending decisions, there was a U-turn on the desire to save £5 billion on the welfare budget. And as again, I think I sort of predicted early doors when Labour got elected, that they would probably U-turn on the two-child benefit cap when circumstances allow. Now, it looks as if that they may well be about to U-turn on that policy, but there isn't the fiscal headroom in actual fact to pay for it. So they're doing something which is political, but which the economics would probably not justify, but they're doing it for political reasons. I mean, if they go down the route of VAT, it would be politically, in my view, less painful than going after income tax, but it's not without economic consequences, because depending on where they levied VAT, at what rate they levied VAT, that in itself would be inflationary, because the chances are that businesses, again, as they did with the national insurance increases and the increases to the national minimum wage, which will go up again, incidentally, on the 26th of November, so there will be further cost pressures on business. These will be passed on, which will be further inflationary when the current level of inflation is running about double the 2% target. So even if you're doing something which politically doesn't look quite so bad in terms of VAT, it does have other economic downturns. And on the point about income tax, which you could say is the most transparent decision because it's the less sneaky one, and it's the one which all voters see in their pay packets at the end of the month. I mean, depending on how much they go for there, the problem with that is, particularly with basic rate taxpayers, if you're taking more money out of their pay packet, then what you will get is a situation where aggregate demand within the economy may well fall because there's less money about to buy goods and services, and that acts as a brake for growth. And if the mantra is growth, 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 and we've both agreed since the day that Labour got back into power that they will stand or fall by their ability to deliver growth. So the income tax increase, if that's what they go for, would be politically, in my view, very damaging, but it would also economically be very damaging in that it would put a brake on their ambitions for growth. It does look to me that she's in just a horrible situation, poor public finances, political pressures from the backbenches to do things which would not be justified by the broader fiscal position. And what we'll probably get is a mishmash of different increases and policy announcements, which will add up to a sum of money. They probably won't, in any sense, reassure the markets at all, and they will muddle through. That would be my view.
I mean, let me put it like this and so on. So, Chancellor, here we go. Budget time. Here are 12 options for you. 10 of them are poisonous. You have to pick 6.
Yeah,
you know,
and the cry on the 26th of November is there's nae money, and it's all the fault of the last government. But of course, as we learn in a Scottish context, Alex, the cry of there's nae money isn't quite the case, because the Auditor General, Stephen Boyle, had some observations this week which indicate that there is a £1 billion underspend in the Scottish budget, which is probably good news for this year, which will probably all be given away when we get the Scottish budget in January, because we're in the run-up to the elections next year. But coming on further down the line, there is a black hole of anything up to £5 billion by financial year 29-30 on the basis of pledges on welfare spending which has been devolved to Holyrood, and increases in public sector pay. So in a sense, you could say that the Scottish Government's position is not as perilous as the UK's government's position in the short term, but in the longer term, there are difficulties unless they take corrective action. But taking the corrective action, which means that you will not hit a £5 billion black hole, is not likely to be politically acceptable.
No. I mean, I think the Scottish Government, of course, must be hoping that Rachel Reeves does her sums and tries to make everything add up by targeting income tax, because, of course, those income tax changes would not apply north of the border, and anything that reduced the difference in taxes levied on people above £30,000 a year would be politically useful for the Scottish Government, because at present somebody on £50,000 a year is paying the thick end of, I think it's £1,500, £1,800 a year more in income tax than they would if they lived in Northumberland. And so anything that reduces that differential is quite useful from the Scottish Government politically, and indeed from the point of view of hard-pressed Scottish taxpayers, income taxpayers. They would love to see, if taxes have to go up, they would prefer it to be income tax, quite clearly, because that wouldn't immediately affect them unless, of course, the Scottish Government decided to follow suit, although the mood music that has been coming from John Swinney and from people like Kate Forbes and so on is that there is very limited room, appetite or enthusiasm for further income tax increases this year in Scotland. But as you correctly say, the Auditor General pointed out this week that the Scottish Government has failed to spend the money it currently has. It's around a £1 billion shortfall so far. Now, the opposition parties have obviously leapt on this, but I think somewhat unfairly, because it seems quite prudent, actually, for the government to try and make sure that it ends each year without having exhausted all its cash, because you never know what's going to come up. Something will happen, a kind of, year-on-year rainy day fund to cope with last-minute unforeseen emergencies is a prudent way of organizing business. Otherwise, you're then if you don't do that, you're then forced to cut a budget elsewhere when things turn up, when events happen, dear boy, as they invariably do. So I think it is sensible for them to try and make sure that they have around a 1.5% underspend each year, just to act as a kind of emergency contingencies fund. But you're absolutely right that the longer term picture, as a result of decisions made by the Scottish Government that it didn't have to make but has chosen to make, is that there is a forecast deficit of, I think it's £4.7 billion by the end of the decade. And the Auditor General, Stephen Boyle, who in many respects is, if you like, the sort of leader of the unofficial opposition in Scotland, it seems to me, he says that the SNP's plans to tackle that widening fiscal gap lack detail. And he also raises concerns that the government cannot clearly demonstrate that public spending is delivering its intended outcomes. Now, lack detail is, of course, a polite way of saying do not exist, is it not?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I have said that in recent times, the real opposition to the government has come from the Auditor General, because some of his observations, I think, go right to the heart of decision-making, which is, haphazard. If you recall, about a year ago, he made the point that government ministers, and again, I would have supported what they did in terms of signing off on pay increases for workers, for public sector workers in a cost of living crisis. They were signing off on inflation busting pay awards, but had absolutely no idea how they were going to pay for them. And the Auditor General was saying, the Auditor General doesn't pass any comment on the political merits of a policy. It's whether or not the policy is sustainable, because when people say that policies are not sustainable, what they really mean by that is that they will run out of money at the end of the day. And you shouldn't lead people up the garden path by spending money, which you will then have to pull in another spending review. We've seen this with the housing budget, for example, where there was a £200 million cut to the housing budget one year. And then there was a reinstatement of 196 million to the budget the year after, because ministers are shuffling around bits of money. Now, that's bad, and the Auditor General criticises that as a style of government, because you cannot properly plan policy on something as significant as housing if you're cutting it by 200 million one year and then reinstating 196 million the following year. It's bad management, and it will lead to poor policy outcomes, as he's actually said. Now, I think that there isn't a plan in place. That's because that if the government had to give an indication of how they're going to plug that black hole, they would have to play their hand politically, and that they are not going to do. And the reality was that in terms of last year, in terms of public sector pay increases, where they hadn't found the money, they were bailed out by the decisions of Rachel Reeves in the budget last year, which is why you're correct that there will be consequentials for Scotland as a consequence of the budget on the 26th of November. That's why the Scottish Government have kicked their budget announcement into January of next year. But in terms of, and you're right again, it's no bad thing for a government to have a contingency. It's absolutely prudent. You wouldn't run your own household finances on the basis of putting everything on tick. So why should the government operate?
Well, actually, I think quite a lot of people do.
I suspect that they used to call this end-year flexibility in the old days, the end-year flexibility of £1 billion. You can bet your bottom dollar they'll do something political with that money in January and in the run-up to the election. But in terms of the £4.7 billion black hole, they will say nothing about that, because it will involve having to face up to some pretty difficult choices. And the difficult choices are around two areas which are very sensitive for the SNP. One is the size of the devolved welfare bill in Scotland, and the second is the trajectory in terms of pay increases in the public sector. And they dare not say anything on those two issues in case they start to get a kickback from their electoral base.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right to highlight the impact of public sector pay, because it's not just giving a generous pay settlement to public sector employees this year. That then becomes the baseline for future increases in subsequent years. So it has a ratcheting effect, not unlike, in certain respects, the triple lock for pensions, which we both agree is in the long term unsustainable, but is a kind of electrified third rail for politics at the moment that nobody dares touch. But eventually somebody is going to have to. But, on the public sector pay in Scotland, here's an example of how this actually works and plays out in practice. In 2023, because of the political need or the political advantage in avoiding any strike action in the NHS, Humza Yousaf's government at the time struck a very generous deal with unions in the health sector, in which not only did workers receive a substantial pay increase, but there was also an agreement reached that NHS employees would have their working hours reduced from 37.5 hours a week to 36 hours a week. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge change, but the way it actually works is that is equivalent to getting rid of 3,000 nurses. And so you then have to employ even more people to make up that shortfall, or you face a cutting clinical services, or a combination of the two. So, the notion that that these changes to employment practices are cost-free, which is how they were presented by the government, is simply false. They come with significant costs attached, not just financial costs, but costs in the delivery of services too. These things are all connected. And, I think that is an example of where, the Scottish Government, for political reasons, wanted to strike a deal. One understands that. You sees the upside for it, but without any real thought to the long-term consequences of doing that. And, sometimes governments have to say no. And actually, quite often, governments have to say no. And one of the problems I think that we have at the moment, and this is something I would suggest is true of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves in London, just as much as it is true of the SNP government in Edinburgh, is that we have governments that are not very good at saying no.
Yeah, and just to reiterate the point that I made, because politicians are taking spending decisions for essentially political and electoral reasons and electoral cycle reasons, which inevitably are for the short term, it cuts across any desire for proper long-term planning in terms of aspects of public policy. In fact, it's a disaster in terms of long-term planning on public policy. And, on that issue, if we get ourselves to a situation next May where there's a proper rainbow parliament and the government that emerges is a sort of loose arrangement of perhaps as many as 3 political parties, you're going to get budgets which are all about short-termism, which are all about the hobby horses of individual parties, and which will cut across any notion of planning in the longer term. I mean, if the SNP are short and have a loose coalition where the Greens are brought back in, for example, it's now perfectly clear that one of their pet policies is not just to have free bus passes for those over 60, not just to have free bus passes for those under the age of 22, but everybody in the country will have a free bus pass. Absolutely everybody in the country will have a free bus pass at an enormous amount of money, which will cut across the ability to plan other public services in the longer term. And if the Liberal Democrats get a sniff of government and are part of a loose arrangement, they'll come up with their menu because they have to say to their voters, this is what we have got from the budget. And, the potential to deal with some of the real underlying issues about economic competitiveness, about economic growth, about the crisis in the university sector, about the sustainability of the so-called free policies, which are the big strategic challenges which the Parliament faces, and what it does with the resources to alleviate poverty. All of that will go because the business of government is about parties being able to say to their own constituents, this is what we managed to do for you. And therefore, the observations of the Auditor General will come home to roost in the circumstances of a government of a loose coalition of 2 or 3 political parties.
Well, that's something to look forward to, isn't it? On that cheery note, people, thank you very much for being with us. Whether you're listening on your phones or you're watching on the YouTube channel, it's always great to hear from you as well. Thank you very much for listening. We will be back soon enough, although actually I'm away next week, so you will have to wait a little bit while for our next episode. But who knows, perhaps in the intervening period before we're back, something will have turned up to brighten the political and economic landscape. But for the time being, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.